Amen. We can take a seat, everybody. My name is Mike Howard. I'm the lead pastor here at Revision. I'm pumped to be here this morning as we continue our series, The Best Summer Ever. And what we've been doing over the last few weeks is looking at some cultural myths many of us have believed that we actually need to release and get rid of if we're going to have the best summer ever. Because Jesus promises us that truth is liberating, which means that when we get a bigger, better vision, a revision of who God is and who He made us to be, we're set free to live the lives He created us for. And this morning, we're going to dive into a topic that I think will resonate with almost every single person in this room. In fact, I think it's one of the most popular misunderstandings among Christians in the Western world. And not just Christians, basically everybody in the Western world who believes that there is a God or might be one. And it's this idea: God just wants you to be happy. Like above all else and no matter what it costs, God's greatest desire for your life is that you would be happy. I remember growing up hoping that that was true and desperately trying to convince my parents that it was. Like specifically, I remember being in 8th grade and basketball season was coming up, and Nike released maybe just the greatest, most beautiful shoe that had ever been created in the history of mankind up to that point. It was called the Air Adjust Force. Look at these bad boys. It came with like straps in multiple colors. You could change them out. You could mix them up. That is a sick shoe right there. And I tried to tell my dad, like, I needed that for basketball season because if I could just get the Nike Air Adjust Force in my team colors, I was going to be happy. And my dad told me that he wasn't sure a shoe that came with its own bra would make me happy. But dads are dumb and they don't know anything. So I talked to my mom about it and she got me the shoes. And I was so pumped to play my first game in them, and then something terrible happened. The team we were playing decided to double team our star player and basically just dare me to shoot the ball. And our coach called me over, and he's like, hey, they're just giving you a shot right inside the paint. You got to take it. So I did on 6 straight possessions, and I missed them all. And on the 7th possession, I was dribbling the ball up the court, hoping that they would make a mistake and come guard me so I could pass it. And I heard their coach yell, hey, keep letting him shoot. Which this is a real shot of confidence to a 13-year-old. And I did 4 more times, and after an 0 for 10 night, these shoes that I knew were going to make me happy didn't make me happy anymore because they were clearly broken. Stupid shoes. I actually quit basketball after that season, which is probably shocking to you. You're like, Mike, you're so tall. It's an optical illusion. The stage adds 2 feet. Now you know. But the shoes, they didn't end up making me happy. So I just moved on to the next thing that I was pretty sure would make me happy. And I know I'm not the only person in this room this morning who's been in that space. Just caught up believing that there's something out there that's going to make us happy when we get it. Even though the last thing didn't, or the thing before that, or the thing before that, or the thing before that. This next thing really will, and then we get it, and then we're still not happy. But we keep on chasing it, and we feel good about chasing it because we know. We know that God just wants us to be happy. Doesn't He? He better, because there's a whole lot of us who are living our lives like that's the case. And here's what I want us to see this morning. This idea that God just wants you to be happy is a half-truth. And some of you church people got real nervous that I even said this is half-true, because you heard it and you're like, wait, what? Because you're like me, you grew up in the church and you've heard a whole bunch of people tell you over and over and over again, God wants you to be holy, not happy. And usually those people looked really unhappy when they said it, so you knew they were serious. You laugh because you know exactly what I'm talking about. There's a whole bunch of churches out there. We grew up in some of them that are full of these grumpy, angry Christians who, like, if you ask them what Jesus' favorite song was, they'd say, if you're happy and you know it, repent. And there's this idea that's floating around that, like, happiness and holiness are at odds with each other. You can be happy or you can be holy. But they're mutually exclusive. You can't be both. And I don't know where that idea comes from, but it doesn't come from God. And it doesn't come from His Word, which constantly tells us to celebrate and delight and take joy and be happy and rejoice. And what we're going to see this morning is actually that holiness and happiness are pretty intimately connected with one another. And that's not an accident. God created you with an extraordinary capacity for happiness on purpose, and something is meant to fill that up. The problem is most of us have no idea what that something is, even though we're convinced we do. And that's where the mistruth and the incredible danger of believing God just wants us to be happy comes in, because we hear that phrase and we translate it in our minds as, God just wants me to do whatever I want to do. There's a whole lot of people out there in our world living that way. The philosopher Voltaire once wrote, God created man in his own image, and now man is returning the favor. Most of us, if we're being honest, what we desperately want is a God who just reflects our desires and rubber stamps all of them. So we take this idea that God created us for happiness and we twist it into this God just wants me to be happy theology that I think assumes three things. One is that whatever I think will make me happy must be right. It must be the right choice. And conversely, whatever I think will make me unhappy must be the wrong choice. And second, that discomfort, suffering, risk, inconvenience, and obstacles must never be God's will for our lives. And finally, comfort, money, pleasure, and things are the ultimate goal of life. Because that's the stuff that we just know will make us happy, right? Here's the conundrum. We have no idea what actually makes us happy. And a lot of the things we think will make us happy end up making us unhappy. And I realize that's a pretty presumptuous thing to say. It may even be offensive. Like if you're here for the first time, you hear me say, you don't know what makes you happy, I do. And you're thinking, who's that guy with his dumb face telling me he knows what I don't? But bear with me for a minute, okay? Here's why I think it's true. If you're chasing happiness, most of you are chasing it pretty passionately and have been your whole lives. There may be like one or two of you out there who are struggling with self-doubt and self-harm and self-loathing. That's a whole different thing. I want to talk to you about it later. But okay, somewhere between 99 and 100% of the people in this room are chasing happiness pretty intentionally and pretty deliberately. Okay, so if you're chasing happiness and you know what will make you happy, then you should be happy. And not just that, you should be super happy, probably all the time. And if you're not, maybe I'm right and you don't know what actually makes you happy. And before you get too offended that I said I know what makes you happy and you don't, let's just admit that every time you pop open your computer screen, every time you turn on your TV or your radio, there are all kinds of people making a lot of money to tell you that you don't know what makes you happy, but they do. And every one of us in this room, no need to raise hands, has fallen for that once or twice or 200 times. And we're still not happy. We're still searching for it. Like Google autocomplete can verify that this is a pressing issue in our lives. Like that right there is sermon research at its finest, folks. I was actually searching for how can I become a millionaire when I found that, so just full disclosure. But like, how can I be happy? Is this question that we ask, that we want to know, and we're looking for an answer, and a whole lot of us have believed that there was this pair of shoes, or there was a shirt or a dress or a car or a phone or a house or a fill in the blank that would finally really make us happy. But it doesn't. Never ever. And here's why. Because happiness is always associated with a who and not a what. Happiness is always associated with a who, not a what. If it was about a what, then I could go get my what, and it wouldn't matter one bit how you treated me, because I could just have my happy what. But that's not true. And a happy what inevitably leads to a happy what else. And we've been there, I know it. You were just as happy with your old phone on the day you got it as you are with your new phone. If your happiness with your what fades over time, like if it deflates as life goes on, then you were never really happy. You were just successfully marketed to. And if you don't believe me, think about this one. Think about global mission trips. A whole lot of you have been to places on this globe where there's extreme poverty. And if you haven't, ask somebody. But this consistently happens to Americans. It happened to our Haiti team just a few months ago. We go to these places and we see these people have so much less than we have, and we come back and ask the question, how can they be so happy when they have nothing? And maybe it's because happiness isn't tied to things. It's tied to people. If you still don't believe me, parents, every one of us knows this is true. Parents are rarely happier than our most unhappy child. It just is. It's hard to be much happier than your least happy child. It's true in marriage too. Husbands are rarely happier than their most unhappy wife, which I think is a phenomenal argument against polygamy. So you're like, yes, but it's hard. It's hard to be happier than your kid or your spouse. And you know why? It's because happiness is tied to who, not what. And last bit of evidence. You still don't have to believe that I'm onto something right now, but I'm pretty sure you will at the end of your life. And you could probably save yourself a whole lot of pain, frustration, and wasted time by realizing it sooner rather than later. Because when your life is coming to a close, if you have regrets, I promise you, they will be relational ones, not possessional ones. Like, oh, if I could just go back and do it all over again, I would have got the iPhone X right away. I don't believe any of us are going to be lying there in that bed like, honey, could you just run to the house real quick and grab my purse collection and bring them here to the hospital? I just want to spend a little bit more time with them before I go. I'm not sold that that's going to happen. And here's the thing. Happiness is relational in nature. It's tied not to comfort, not to wealth, not to things. It's tied to connection, to God and to people. And when we miss this, when we buy the lie that the world is selling us, the tragic irony is that we miss God. We miss the people that he created for us and created us for. And we miss the lasting, deep, true happiness that we were made to experience. Man, it's easy to spend our lives, though, trying to fill that void. But there's good news. Jesus actually told us how we can do it. If you have your Bibles or your Bibles with you this morning, you can open them up to Matthew chapter 5. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry, the words will be on the screen. If you don't own one, please take one from the Next Steps table on your way out. We got them in all kinds of colors and kids' versions. We'd love to give you one. But Matthew chapter 5, here's what's going on. This whole crowd of people got together, and they wanted to hear from Jesus. And there were like too many of them, so he went up on a hillside, and he sat down. And they gathered around him, and he started to talk. And the very first thing that he said, okay, he preaches this sermon. It's called the Sermon on the Mount, most famous sermon ever preached. And the first thing Jesus did was give everybody 8 tips for being happy. And if you're a church person, you know that these are called the Beatitudes. And here's the reason we call them the Beatitudes. Beatitudes is this American transliteration. We basically made up a word that sounds like this Latin word beatus, which means happiness. And in the Latin translation of the Bible, they translated the Greek word makarios as beatus. And makarios is the word that when we open up Matthew 5, it's going to say blessed. Or if you're a churchy person, blessed, right? And that's the way we translate it. But makarios literally means super happy. This is a term that the first century Jewish people used to refer to someone who was saved by God. And so Jesus looks at this giant crowd of people. He's like, what do I got to tell them first? I want to tell them that this is what the heart of a saved person looks like. Like, this is what true happiness is. Okay, so verse 3 kicks it off. He said, blessed, makarios, happy are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. What in the world does it mean to be poor in spirit? Well, it means embracing your daily dependence on God for everything you need. Being poor in spirit is this acknowledgement that you don't have sufficient resources on your own to handle everything life throws at you. Like, poverty of spirit has nothing to do with your material wealth or lack thereof, with what you have or what you don't have. It has everything to do with acknowledging that all of that comes from God. That he is not only the source, but he's the sustainer. And without him, there isn't a thing that we can do to be okay. It's being poor before God so that he can be rich to us. There's actually 2 Greek words in the New Testament for poor. And the first one refers to people who don't have much money, who like barely can afford to eat. Here at Vision, we call those med school students. And the second one is this word I love that Jesus uses, this word ptokos. It's an onomatopoeia, like one of those words that sounds like what it's describing, like buzz, boom, crash, ptokos. It sounds like spitting on someone. That's exactly what it meant to first century Greeks. Poor, despised, like the ew people, the nobodies who are worth nothing and have nothing, they're despised. The problem for us as Americans is that we very rarely feel that way. We very rarely look in the mirror and see ptokos. We pay lip service to the idea that God is the provider. And we talk about trusting him for our daily bread, but somewhere deep down in our souls, we don't want to be spiritually poor. We want to be spiritually rich, or at least like spiritually middle class. Like, if God fails, if he doesn't actually come through, that's cool, because my bank account will save me. My ingenuity will save me. My ability will save me. I'm pretty content, and I'm pretty able, and I'm pretty sufficient all on my own, just in case God isn't who God says that he is, and God doesn't do what God promised me he'll do. I got this. And slowly, what happens when we start to think that way, and it happens for most of us unintentionally, is that we begin to put our faith and our trust in ourselves and our stuff. We find that our hearts grow proud, selfish, and ungrateful. And it robs us of our joy because it's an illusion. The truth is that every breath we take and every heartbeat that happens inside our chests is a gift from God. Whether we acknowledge it or not, but when we acknowledge it, when we come before God knowing that that's the case, what we find is that God only fills empty hands. But what he fills them with is his love and his kingdom. So if I could sum up what Jesus is saying here in this verse, it's just like one simple phrase, it would be this: happy people place their trust in the giver and not the gifts. Happy people bank their lives on the giver, but never the gifts. And Jesus continues in verse 4. He's got another one. He says, blessed, Makarios, happy are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Which feels a little bit weird and counterintuitive. I don't know if you notice that, but I do every time I read it, that mourning and happiness feel like they don't go together really well. But you guys know who mourns? Like the kind of people that mourn are people who are relationally connected. They're people who have empathy and relationship with others who are hurting. They're people who are self-aware and emotionally secure. That's who mourns. People who mourn are those who realize that there is injustice and there's hurt and there's pain in the world, and it is not okay. That death is inevitably a part of life, and they don't try and run from that, and they don't try and avoid that, and they don't try and cut themselves off from it. Instead, they lean in. They lean into the pain that is all around them. They lean into the hurt of the people who are right in front of their faces, and this is an uncommon thing in our world. Like in our culture, it's just not what we do. Because we got plenty of ways to self-medicate out the pain and out the hurt and out the idea that death is even possible. Death is like so sanitized for us. We keep dying people as far away from us as we possibly can. And for a whole lot of us, like if we got to go to a funeral, we just figure out what time it is. We show up 15 minutes late, get out of there as quick as we can, and grab a drink on the way home to numb it. Anytime we read about a tragedy that occurred in the world, like we don't want to lean in. We want to pull out our phones and just like check social media to numb the pain away. Sit down, turn on Netflix or some other form of amusement. Amuse means without thinking. Some form of amusement so that we don't have to think about the very real pain and the very real suffering and the very reality of death in our world, because we're scared. We're scared. We don't want to hurt, and we don't want to die, and we're terrified of it. But happy people aren't terrified of it. Happy people lean in. Happy people lean in to those around them. And what they find is that profound sadness actually creates space for profound happiness. And this hope that life and sadness and brokenness are not the end, because Jesus came and he died on a cross and he rose again to set all things right and make all things new, that it is coming. This hope is never found in the numb middle. It's found in leaning in. So if I could sum this one up, I'd say this: happy people don't let the fear of death rob them of the joy of living. They just lean in. They lean in. Okay, and Jesus gives us the third key to happiness in verse 5. He said, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And this one feels a little wimpy. I probably would have objected if I was sitting there listening to Jesus and he said it, because like meek is one of those words, it doesn't show up on any of our to-do lists. Like when we sit down and dream and like, oh, what I want to be when I grow up is meek is never on that list. And as a dads in here can affirm this. You do not look at your daughter and say, sweetheart, could you just, like what I really am praying for you is you could just find a meek man to marry. I don't want that. I want to be strong and protect her and have a job, not meek. But we associate meekness with weakness, but that's not actually what Jesus is describing here. The word that he uses is actually probably better related and more closely related to humility. Meekness means having a proper picture of who you are in terms of the broader context of all God's creation and his love. It's this self-awareness that you're like this part of God's creation. He loves you and he's up to something, but maybe possibly you're not the center of it all. It's this ability to say, like, this whole life thing is not about me. I'm not aiming my life in the direction of getting more fans and more followers and more likes and doing whatever I want to do. I believe that God made me for something bigger than that. He made me and gifted me. So I'm not trying to be or do anything more than what he made me to be and asked me to do for the sake of the people around me. I'm at 100% at peace with how God loves me and who God made me. Happiness is found in that. Happy people embrace humility. Happy people live into humility. And Jesus continues in verse 6. He says, happy are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. And there are a whole lot of things in this world that we hunger and thirst for. Lunch, I don't know, I've been up since 5:30, but also fame and power and sex and money, influence and approval. But Jesus said it's those who hunger and thirst for righteousness that are going to end up filled. See, there's this hole that exists inside every single one of our souls, and it can't be filled with all that stuff we're trying to fill it with. It can only be filled by Jesus. And chasing him leaves us happy, where chasing the world leaves us empty. And I think this is something intuitively most of us know. Just take a second and think about your greatest regrets. Like the deepest moments of hurt and pain in your life, those things that you've done that you wish you could go back and erase. You wish you could blot out. You wish you could hide away so that nobody ever found out about them. I'd be willing to bet that the stuff that's running through your head right now comes from the times when you knew what was right and chose what was wrong. And your conscience and the wounds of the consequences still haunt you. I want to take a quick time out on that thought and rewind to last week, where we talked about how the cross of Jesus Christ is sufficient for you. There's nothing that can separate you from his love. His blood counts. So if you put your faith in him, you don't have to be defined, not for one more second, by what you did. You can be defined by what he did for you. Believe that the cross is sufficient for you and live into that grace. But what Jesus is saying here is listen, I know this sounds super religious and maybe like, a little uptight, but your behavior actually does affect your happiness. It does. And when you chase holiness, you end up avoiding some of the potholes of regret and pain. You end up missing out on some of the scars you might have picked up along the way if you weren't hungry for what was right. Happy people live with a clear conscience. Happy people chase Jesus, and they live with a conscience that's clear. Okay, verse 7, Jesus continues. He says, blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. I actually think this is the easiest one to understand and the hardest to put into practice, like on a deep soul level. Maybe it's not hard for you, but it's hard if you're a jerk like me. Like happiness is found in being relationally generous, like in giving the people around us what they don't deserve. Happiness is found in being unfair to the people around us, specifically the ones who have hurt us most deeply. It's just deciding, I'm not going to seek revenge. I refuse to allow myself to be bitter. I will not hold a grudge. You know what? You have never met a happy, bitter person. We all know that. But you have met some people who've been hurt. Some people who've been like gut-wrenchingly, awfully, painfully wounded, and they came out the other side happy. Because somewhere along the line, they decided, you know what? God reached down into my brokenness when I didn't do anything to deserve it. And he extended mercy and grace to me. So you know what? I'm just going to do the same thing to my dad, my boss, my husband, my ex-wife, that bully at my school. I'm just going to do the same thing. You guys, hatred is the poison we drink, hoping that it's going to hurt somebody else. And the longer we hold onto bitterness, the deeper it holds onto us. And Jesus promises us that when we release it, we find the freedom and the joy that we were made for. The simple truth is this: happy people forgive generously, just lavishly. Whenever there's a chance, they forgive. And happiness is found on the other side of that. Sixth key to happiness. Let me warn you real quick. This one's really offensive. When I sit with people in counseling meetings and I point this one out, they don't like it always. It's kind of dangerous. I don't like it always. Jesus says this one in verse 8, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. I love this one. He kind of baits us in. He's like, hey, who wants to see God? Oh, you do? Do you want to live with like more clarity? Would you like to have an incredibly crystal clear picture of not just who God is, but who he made you to be and the path that he has for you in this life? Would you like to live with that kind of clarity, like as much clarity as anyone could possibly have in the world? Do you want to recognize his plans? Do you want to be able to see and recognize where God is at work, where he's moving in the world? Like, yes. Oh, sweet. Live pure. It's like an uncomfortable truth for a whole lot of us that we can't chase Jesus and chase sin at the same time. A lot of us have been trying. A whole bunch of us, we got our own little pet sin, and it's just ours, and no one knows about it, and it's fine, and it's not really hurting us, and we're trying to convince ourselves it's okay. And we really deep down, we desperately want to believe that it doesn't cut us off from God in any real tangible way. And then we walk out the door and we're like, God is just really hard to understand. I can't really see him, and it's just like such a struggle to figure out what his plan is for my life. It's so hard to follow God. And that darkness exists inside our souls, not inside of him. It just does. Look at my experience as a pastor. I see this all the time. People want to talk, and their lives are just jacked up. And they say this: how did I not see it coming? How did I not see it coming? And look, I've been in that same boat. I've asked that same question. I've struggled that same struggle. How did I not see it coming? My answer, this is where people get offended, is, Jesus has some thoughts on that. Like, Jesus is calling us to chase holiness because he knows that happiness is found on the other side. He invites us to purity, right in the middle of a culture that doesn't even use that word except when we're talking about water. It just is. It's like this lame, old-fashioned idea that means we miss out, right? We miss out on all that awesome stuff of the world that seems like it'd be so cool, but it's just impure. Like if seeing God, if knowing his will for my life, if being able to recognize where he's at work and where he's moving in the world is missing out, count me in. Count me in, because that's what purity, mental purity, emotional purity, spiritual purity affords us. And it affords us the opportunity, too, to realize we don't have to experience everything to understand it. There's not a lot of people out there in our world that call us to this. Not a lot of spaces where we get reminded of it. But I want you to know today, if you want a bigger, better vision of who God is and who he made you to be, if you want to live fully, happy people understand that purity leads to clarity. Happy people get it, that purity is the pathway to seeing who God is and who he made him to be. Number 9, Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. You guys, the world is full of jerks. Okay, you may be sitting next to one right now. Don't point. Don't point. All the married people in here are doing this right now. Except for my wife. She's pointing at me. I said, I'm pointing, Jenny. I'm just kidding. She's in the hallway in the nursery. But if she was here, she would be pointing at me. Because, as I said, the world is full of jerks. And don't tell her I said that. But here's the thing. I've found in my couple of years on this planet that almost every conflict has a minimum of 2 sides that are absolutely convinced of the manifest rightness of their position. And the thing is, peace can't be made, reconciliation can't happen, forgiveness can't even happen if being right is what matters most. Like if you have to be personally vindicated when you disagree with somebody, then you're either never going to be personally vindicated or you're never going to make peace. It just doesn't happen. Jesus says, check it out, God makes peace. God doesn't just sit up in heaven waiting for peace. God doesn't blame it on the other person and see if someday they'll make peace. God doesn't give them the cold shoulder or the stink eye and give them a piece of his mind until they make peace. God actively, intentionally steps out and makes peace. The cross was God making peace with a world that was absolutely wrong when he was absolutely right. But his rightness mattered less than his love. And for us, Jesus said we will be called children of God when we decide we're going to imitate him in this. That we're not going to wait for peace, that we're going to blame others and put it on them. We're going to walk out and intentionally, actively be reconcilers and make peace. I'd sum it up like this. Happy people value relationships more than they value being right. There's happiness that's found when you let your love grow bigger than your ego. And the last one in verse 10, Jesus says, Makarios are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And of all of them, like, I don't like all of these. I'm not comfortable with all these. I don't always live all of these out very well. But of all of them, this is the one where I just want to call time out on Jesus. Like, I can track with him. I can at least wrap my mind around what he's saying right up to the point where he uses persecution and happiness as synonyms. At that point, he has lost the plot, right? But he's super confused because that's exactly what he does. Exactly what he does. He says happiness is found in prioritizing being right with God and chasing his will and purpose above all things with the full knowledge that it won't always go well while we're doing that. Seems crazy, but you know what? There's something that every single one of us will figure out at some point during our lives. Most of us probably already know it, and if you don't, let me help you along the way. You will suffer. At some point in your life, you will suffer. It's just part of the brokenness of living in this shattered space. The thing is, you will suffer for doing wrong, or you will suffer for doing right. You're going to suffer for one of the two. There's no question about it, but you can only be happy when you're suffering for doing what's right, because there's this deep peace that inhabits your soul, that you're chasing after God. And so your suffering doesn't get to write the final chapter of your story. God does. And that peace changes everything. Happy people hold on to hope in the middle of brokenness. Just refuse to let it go. Even though the world is shattered, we know that suffering is not the end. The end is God setting all things right and making all things new. So I want to invite you this morning to be happy. Like, truly happy, because God wants you. God created you to be happy. But to do it, you will have to walk away from the belief that happiness can be found in chasing what you think will make you happy and accumulating all the stuff of this world. You'll have to remember that happiness is always associated with a who and not a what. It's relational. It's found in connection with God and his people. In John 15, Jesus gave us this powerful word picture. He said, I'm the vine and you are the branches. As long as you remain in me, you'll bear much fruit, but apart from me, you can do nothing. And happiness is the fruit that comes from lives that are connected to the vine. And I realize, like, I give you 8 things this morning. Like, Jesus has given us 8 tips to happiness. There's a lot of them, but you know what the common denominator is in every single one of those? They are all attitudes, not circumstances. Every one of them. See, our word happiness in English comes from the same root word as happening or happenstance, like the stuff that happens to us. And there are a whole lot of people out there in our world believing that their happiness is tied to their circumstances. And if things would just change, then they could be happy. Or if they could get the right things, the right what's, then their circumstances will have shifted in a way that allows them to be happy, and it's simply not true. God is inviting you to something more today, to this deep and abiding happiness that isn't fleeting, it isn't unreachable, it isn't ethereal, it isn't fickle, it isn't uncontrollable. It's a product of a life aimed in his direction. Happiness is an outcome. Happiness is an outcome, and that doesn't mean things are never going to go wrong in your life. It doesn't mean you're never going to feel pain. Jesus pretty much promised us that when he connected happiness to poverty, mourning, and suffering. But you can have a different perspective on life and the future while that stuff is happening to you. Happiness is an outcome. It's a product of knowing who God is and who he made us to be, of leaning into his love and sharing it with the world around us. Does God want you to be happy? Yes, unequivocally, yes. He created you for it. But the only way you can ever get there is his way. And you guys, I think if we get this one right, if we stop chasing the mirage of happiness the world has thrown out there and we walk this countercultural path, what we'll find is not only freedom and joy and meaning and purpose like we've never known before in our own souls, but we will radiate it to the unhappy dark which surrounds us in a way that's incredibly compelling to a world that's desperately searching for what we've already found. Will you guys pray with me? God, thank you for grace. Thank you for love. Thank you for reaching out when we didn't deserve it, for stepping in to our story and setting all things right and making all things new. Thank you for creating space for us to be happy when we've earned depression, when we've earned frustration. God, please do a work in us today. Reorient our hearts. Give us a bigger, better vision, just of who you are and who you created us to be, so that we stop chasing all the empty stuff that we've been wasting time on. So we stop believing that our circumstances control our happiness. We start trusting that you are enough and you're full and you're complete, and happiness is found in aiming our lives in your direction. God, let us do that this morning and let us shine. Let us glow with that happiness, just filled up to overflowing in a way that makes an impact on a dark and hurting world. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.